And so let me introduce our panel moderator and one of our discussants in the panel, Dr. Araba. Araba is a principal researcher with Research ICT Africa and a senior research scientist at the University of Washington. She studies many things, including the social and economic impacts of digitization, digital inclusion, and digital access, particularly in the African continent. So I'm so glad to welcome Dr. Araba to moderate this discussion with Dr. Radhika Khosla on research to practice in the developing world. So Araba, over to you, and please feel free to introduce yourself more to us before we begin the discussion.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to go straight into the discussion so that we can make the most use of the time to get additional insights from Radhika, but also to hear from our viewers. So first of all, thank you, Radhika, for that fascinating insights into these issues of climate change, and especially in the developing country context. Thanks to all the participants who have joined us today. For me, this is also an unusual audience and an unusual topic. But I think there's some interaction with the work that I do, which I will come to in a moment. So we're going to have this panel in two parts. First, a brief discussion between myself and Radhika, and then we'll try to reserve as much time as we can for some Q&A. So please do drop your questions, comments, etc. in the chat while we're talking. The issues Radhika has raised, though they're coming from a different field, they are reminiscent of debates within the ICT4D community, which is the Information and Communication Technologies for Development community. And I imagine these are issues that the mechanism designed for social good community is also been grappling with. Things like the tension between technological development and inclusive growth, inclusive development. These questions about the relative importance or significance of demographic and behavioral variables on the outcomes of technology use, as well as the outcomes of the use of technologies that have energy consumption implications. And I think for me, maybe even more significantly, this question of where is the tipping point? When do we actually, see that growth, that big push that dramatically changes the trajectory on which we are moving? So for the next 15 or so minutes, I want to invite us to consider three topics. One, what is the potential role of technology? And in this case, I'm thinking specifically about information and communication technologies in contributing to solving the climate-related challenges that Radhika has mentioned. Thinking of this, especially in view of the fact that your research has shown that households, even in low-income countries, even low-income households, prioritize entertainment over other, brown and white goods. And this is something that we have also observed in our work in digital access, is that even the uses to which people put those tools, which are seen as potentially having what one might call productive versus less productive uses, they tend to or at least prioritize entertainment-like or leisure-like uses of these technologies. But what does that mean, and how can technology play a role to solve these big issues? Secondly, we try to touch on the extractive nature of research and knowledge production. This is because we as researchers, that's our work, right? Our work is to extract knowledge, but how can we do this in a more mutually beneficial way with the communities in which we work? And then briefly, we'll touch on the pathways to from research to policy and the challenges that we also face there. So first, I want to just a few thoughts of my own on the role of technology, especially artificial intelligence in in climate change and sustainable development. When I started studying in this field, the development community was preoccupied with broadcasting and mass media as the tools for development. When I started working in the area, the technological landscape had shifted to computers, internet, and then the mobile phones. And now there's another shift happening, which is towards AI algorithms, machine learning, data-heavy technologies. And no doubt, many lives have been enriched by the affordances that these technologies provide. And there are a lot of people who believe that these technologies can play a role in resolving climate change problems. But after decades of ICT for development, I find that the majority of poor people are still poor. The majority of developing countries are still developing countries. And the majority of ICT4D projects have been essentially partial or full failures. And we are still asking the same questions about how technologies can be used to generate human development. Now, some reasons for these challenges in the digital realm are that digital access is still seriously limited in many parts of the world, even though they're important technologies for families. Not just because they don't have the technology, that they may not have the most modern versions of those technologies. So everybody has a cell phone, but they may not have a smartphone, which is where everything is moving towards. So they can't keep up with the technological changes either. Large proportions of those who do have access lack the financial means, the skills, or the quality of connectivity to make use of the technologies to their full extent. And oftentimes the broader ecosystem that needs to be in place for technology to have its impact is missing. There's also the fact that non-profit, for-profit organizations are expected to be the ones that were expected to eventually see low-income populations as viable markets. So as I was asking Radhika, what role do you think technology can play, digital technologies can play in addressing climate change in a sustainable manner? And how can we avoid repeating the mistakes of the past in not considering the limits of technology?
Thanks, Araba. And I'd love to talk to you more about this and sort of have a chance to hear more about your examples. I mean, I'll be brief, and I think if we stay with the with the purview of households, then demand response, which is when you can use smart meters, so use digital technologies, information technologies that are in your tied with your appliances, and also so they speak both to your appliances and also speak to the grid and to the electricity grid, and can communicate between the electricity grid and your needs in your household. That is, in some sense, that's the frontier of where we're headed. Now, whether that sort of technological shift alone is going to take care of all the loopholes and the mistakes of the past, I don't think so. And I think that is true in sort of the work we've been doing, and some of the examples that I've been showing are using that same point, which is to say that technologies alone are just not enough. It's how we use those technologies, and similarly, sort of if we're in the world where we're modeling, then how do we model the use of those technologies? Sort of assuming that everyone uses technologies in the same way, or everyone has equal access to technologies, is just not an accurate representation. And so I think building that kind of nuance and texture into this discussion is important. And so we've been trying to do that. But I'd say the short answer is demand side management, but one that allows and takes care of this idea of access and equal access for everyone.
Thanks, Radhika. Secondly, noting that many careers, including academic careers, are built on the premise of information and communication technologies for development. And with all the explorations going on in the developing countries in particular, have become experimental grounds for students, for professors, for practitioners, as we try to understand the potential and the limits of technology. Unfortunately, it's debatable how much our work actually benefits the communities we do our research in the long term, after we have left to write our reports, our journal articles, books, or build our prototypes. So why do you think this, what do you think are the reasons for this continued disconnect and for the extractive nature of research? And how do you think it affects the sustainability of our outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can have a whole session on that topic, right? In some sense, you know, why it happens is I mean, there's a sort of very complicated piece around you know, the rewards of academic life and what it merits in terms of publications versus actually you know, the impact on communities. But I think what is important is, in some sense, you know, where are the examples of how academic output can actually be beneficial to communities, right? And how can academic output be able to inform policy? So I think, you know, in the work that we do with data collection and publishing it academically, for us, there's like an equal push to be able to inform local and work with, in partnership with, and co-produce knowledge in you know, with local level communities or the stakeholders who are in power there through government or, you know, sort of non-governmental organizations. And I think that's the way to break that cycle that you're talking about, Araba, because that cycle is very entrenched, right? In many ways, you have this sort of parachuting of researchers coming in, taking the knowledge they need, and then leaving. And then actually, there are so many examples where researchers are not even at the site; they're not even in situ, right? You're actually producing knowledge by not even being in the place that you're talking about. And so I think what we really need to look to and move towards are the better and best practices around how not to do that.
Thank you. I think you may have actually preempted the next question I was going to ask, and a question that I'm seeing in the chat. So I'm going to hand over to Irene now so that we can at least have 5 minutes for audience reaction.
Yes, of course. And I was going to comment the same thing, that Radhika, I think you're starting to touch on this question that came up in the chat. And I'm actually going to pose this question to both of you, Radhika and Araba. And the question is fairly long, but let me read it out to you. One of the core issues, it seems, is that in AI system, fairness continues to be a ubiquitous principle, but this fairness is in quotation marks. If we are actually going to leverage technology in ways that we support different types of populations, I feel we need to prioritize justice in the design, development, and management of these systems. And so the question is, how can we redefine how we approach AI systems, especially those related to AI for social good or sustainable development goals that center justice? What are the approaches that we can explore further? One example could be participatory action research.
Yeah, should we have Araba go first, maybe?
Okay. Yeah, I think this is one of the, you know, maybe defining questions of our time as we try to see how AI is going to influence populations at large. For me, the issue of defining justice is itself as challenging as what it means to define fairness. And so I think one of the first things we need to do is to figure out what we mean when we say justice, and whether there need to be contextual definitions of justice. A lot of the debates, the conversation, the frameworks that are emerging to govern AI are actually coming from the Western world. And so in answer to this question, I think one of the things that we could do is to try to include more of the voices of leaders and communities in developing countries in that conversation, so that non-Western notions of justice and fairness are also incorporated into those systems. Thanks.
I'll just add to that by saying absolutely agree, and not just non-Western ideas of justice, but also sort of non-Western and local indigenous, sort of means in which practices evolve, right? So it's not just about, so sort of what is considered a mainstream practice. Our ideas of those practices are actually quite narrowly defined by researchers in certain sort of parts of the world, usually Western parts of the world. But I think it's not just sort of, how we think about justice, but how we think about what is normal practice, what is everyday practice, whether that is around energy consumption or other aspects of culture. Sort of drawing that in and actually learning from local communities and co-producing, as I was talking about earlier, is really key to that, but also recognizing that there isn't something ubiquitous here. There is so much local level information, and each of that needs to be drawn out for the local level. And you can learn across cultures, as we always do, but also there is a lot to be determined in terms of what is relevant for a particular area.
I'll just add very briefly that universal question for me is take a step back and examine your forward, or for that assumes that the technology can be used in that way. And I think you should always see what the systems are that are producing the technology to determine whether or not the technology can be used in quotes for good or for development.
Great, thank you so much. We lost you for a little bit of that, Araba, but we were able to catch the end. So thank you for that sharing. I'm gonna take the liberty here and allow us time for one or two more questions since we haven't had that much Q&A, and we'll go into the break after those questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat. I'm gonna ask one of my own. I was wondering, both of you started touching on this, but can you give examples in your own work of how you address this tension, this incentive in research to kind of parachute, go in and find the interesting knowledge, and how do we ensure that we're answering the community's questions rather than our own? How do we ensure that we're addressing the problem in the long run and not just in the moment that we're there conducting the research?
Not easily. And I can't say I have been necessarily successful yet in any of this effort in my 15 or so years working in research and academia. But what I have been trying to do recently, and I'm beginning to see some fruits over the last 7 or so years, is to build lasting relationships in the field and to return to those places for the research that I do. So rather than choosing a different location every time you have a research project, I try to make that community sort of part of my research agenda, but make my research agenda also their research agenda, and sort of focus on the issues that they are interested in. So I have a couple of projects now where I'm working in a community that I actually have a 10-year relationship with. I used to take students there on a study abroad program. I took them to the same place every year for 7 years. So that relationship developed over time. And then when I had the opportunity to do a research project with something, I had not much resources, but significant enough to do a project on the ground. I went to that community and said, I have some money to do some research. We want to do something in your community. What sort of research can we do here? What would be, most helpful to you? We have this broad agenda of gender equality, digital equality, STEM education, but that was the broad the framework. And then together with them, we developed a project, and we're starting to work on it now. So in that sense, I feel that at least the community knows that I have been committed to them over time. And so they're willing to also participate in this effort because it's hopefully mutually beneficial to them as well. And so I think that's just an example of the sort of thing that one could do. It's not easy, and it doesn't fit the timeline of our research projects and our professional evaluations and research grant funding and so on. But if we could get the institutions to change as well to reward this type of research, I think we would go a long way to changing the parachute research phenomenon.
I love that. Thank you, Araba. And Radhika, do you want to add anything to that question?
Just to sort of echo the importance of relationships and also just say, that you have to take it slow. Like there is no sort of fast track here in some sense. Really building trust and time and credibility with the communities that we're trying to understand and work with. And along with that, I'd say I find that engaging with policy is another way in which to have a lasting impact. And informing policy, particularly in contexts where actually, research and evidence is limited. I think we actually have a role and a responsibility in terms of not only, sort of helping build some of that evidence, but then also having that evidence be used in a way that is helpful for that community through policymakers.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. And I'm going to throw in one last question that kind of riffs off the one I see in the chat. In 1 minute or less, do you have an exhortation or encouragement for our listeners for what can they do? And so there's a question in the chat, well, what do I do as a white American and all the privilege that carries? What does that mean for entering into these developing world questions? Also for the students who might be nervous about the amount of time and energy that seems to need to be invested to do this really a joint research with communities. Where can our listeners start?
Oh boy, only 1 minute. I think, honestly, trying to let go of your stance as a researcher who knows and giving over the ownership of the research and even the design of the research and the execution of the research to the communities you're doing the work in is one of the best ways to find your place in that scenario. So rather than going in with your research and then having the community try and find its place in it, do it the other way around and see what happens. Now, again, I have to be honest, it doesn't always work. It doesn't always work out, but you have to try and start that way. And the more you do it, the more you learn how to take that stance, and the more I think success you'll have over time in doing this kind of work where you relinquish your position as the external Western researcher who knows. And I say this as someone who haven't spent so much time in the West. I'm almost seen as a Westerner when I go back home. And so I also have to try and take that stance myself when I go into communities.
Thank you so much, Araba. Radhika?
I'll be quick. I'd say no matter what it is that you're trying to research, it will take time and effort. And one there isn't anything to be afraid of with regarding that. It's, actually the reward is in that effort, and so just to embrace that. And second, I'd say, I'd say, like, I mean, it's important to recognize one's role and the positionality around that, and it's key, but I would not make it a burden. I think what's important is that there's genuine interest and in wanting to understand and contribute to a place and an issue, and that should be the driving force, not so much really, the particular burden of identity that one can carry. I would urge to be free of that a little bit so that the focus can be on the work. Some of the best scholars I've seen of art don't come from the places that they're working on. And there is value to that because there's a different perspective that comes from that, which we also need.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Radhika and Araba, and all our listeners for being here today. I just want to add my own exhortation that I think EAAMO and MD4SG are trying to do this kind of community-driven work in partnership with those who we are conducting our research with. And so I think there's space for this, and I've seen this in my own work, that when you genuinely care about a community and you go in with a researcher mindset, you're able to have impact in that community. And then even though it's non-standard in academia, we also are recognized for that in the academic space. So just an exhortation that I think this is a new, in many ways, way of doing research for many people, but I think everyone sees the value in it.